Welcome to Eternal Dread, where fear never sleeps. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is, because terror has no limits. If you're brave enough, share and comment, but beware, something might be watching you too. Now, turn off the lights and let the dread begin. I've never been one for paranoia. I always thought I was pretty good at staying level-headed. But then again, I guess that's easy to say when nothing's ever really tested your grip on reality. That was until it all started. It was just a text at first. The kind of thing you wouldn't pay much attention to if it wasn't for the timing. It came in right after I'd sent a message to my friend asking if they'd seen the latest episode of some show we'd been following. Simple enough. But instead of a reply, this came through. "You're going to regret this. I know what you did." It didn't make sense. I stared at the screen, thinking it was some sick joke, maybe a wrong number, or someone pulling some petty prank. But something about it nagged at me. A few seconds later, another message pinged in. "I've been watching. You can't hide from me. Not anymore." I tried to laugh it off. Hell, I deleted the message and moved on. But the feeling lingered. It stayed with me that entire night, gnawing at the back of my mind, like a loose thread I couldn't stop tugging at. The next day, I got another one. This time it was a picture, a photo of me, taken outside my apartment, just as I'd walked out to get the mail. It was blurry, a little grainy, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. The text that followed was simple. "You're being watched. Next time you go out, I'll be closer." I don't know what compelled me to reply. Maybe it was that creeping sense of dread, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that this was all a prank. I sent a short message back. "Who is this?" A few minutes passed. The phone stayed silent, and I thought maybe that was it. That was the end of it. I was wrong. The response came in right before I fell asleep. "I told you, I know what you did." I tried to ignore it. I really did. But it wasn't that simple. By the time the third message came in, I felt my heart in my throat. This time it was a voice message. The sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, like they were sitting just outside my door. The whisper followed shortly after. "You've got nowhere to run." That was the moment I realized it wasn't a joke. Someone knew something about me. Something they shouldn't have known. And that knowledge wasn't coming from nowhere. I tried to shake the thought from my mind, but it stuck. I thought about the things I'd done. The things I thought were buried in the past. There were whispers now. I could hear them echoing in the silence of my apartment. And somewhere in the back of my head, I couldn't stop asking myself, what did I do? The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. Work felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Every time I picked up my phone, I half expected another message. I stopped going out. I began locking the door, even when I was just in the bathroom. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? I couldn't explain something I didn't understand. What could I say? Someone's threatening me, but I don't know who or why. That would be the end of my credibility, and I wasn't sure I had enough left to spare. But the messages kept coming. The blackmailer was relentless. They'd send something small, something trivial. At first, a reminder that I was still under their watch. A picture of me walking home from the bus stop, or a snapshot of my car in the parking lot. Nothing huge, just enough to let me know they were always there, just out of sight. Then one night it escalated. It was past midnight when I got a call. Unknown number. I stared at it for a few seconds, heart pounding in my chest. I almost didn't pick up. Something told me I shouldn't, but I did anyway. "Hello," I said, my voice cracking. It wasn't like me. I hated how shaky I sounded. I could already hear the person on the other end breathing, slow, deliberate, like they were savoring the moment. "Do you remember what you did?" the voice asked. I froze. It was a whisper, but it was clear. Too clear. My blood ran cold. It sounded so familiar, like I should know it, but I couldn't place it. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to scream, to demand they leave me alone, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. All I could hear was my own ragged breathing. "I told you," the voice continued, "you can't hide. You can't run. I'm always watching." Then there was silence, just a few seconds of horrible, suffocating silence. "Tomorrow," they said, their voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. "You'll do something for me. Don't try to be clever. I'll be watching." The call ended abruptly. I didn't move for a long time. I don't know if it was minutes or hours. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. It wasn't possible. They couldn't know about that. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to be sick, but I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just pretend it wasn't happening. Whatever I'd done, they knew. And they were going to make sure I paid for it. The next morning, the first thing I did was check my phone. Sure enough, there was a message. Just a simple line of text. "You've got a job to do." A few minutes later, a location popped up. It was an address, an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. I should have ignored it. I should have called the police, told someone, anyone, that I was being blackmailed. But something kept me from doing it. That feeling like I was already caught in a trap, with no way out, and running was pointless. I thought about the things I'd done. The dark, unspeakable things. And I thought about how desperate I was to keep them buried. I knew I'd have to do whatever it was. I'd have to follow these twisted orders, or risk losing everything. I didn't know what was waiting for me at that warehouse. But I knew deep down that it would be the beginning of something I couldn't undo. The warehouse was just as abandoned as I expected. Graffiti-covered walls, shattered windows, rust curling at the edges of the loading docks like something diseased. The place stank of rot and stagnant water. I didn't want to be here. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to pretend I'd never seen that message, but I couldn't. I was in too deep now. I pulled my hood up, shoved my hands in my pockets, and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust. The long-abandoned shelves loomed in the dim light, casting twisted, skeletal shadows across the floor. Something about the space felt wrong. Not just empty, but hollow, like whatever life had once filled it had been scooped out and replaced with something unnatural. Then my phone vibrated. A new message. "Go to the back office." I hesitated. My breathing felt too loud. Each step echoed, stretching longer than it should have in the silence. The floor was littered with old receipts, broken glass, a lone shoe with its laces missing. I reached the office door and pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick, humid. The single overhead light flickered, barely illuminating the room. The first thing I noticed was the chair, positioned perfectly in the center, facing the doorway. The second thing I noticed was the TV on the desk. It was one of those old, boxy models, the kind that buzzed even when they weren't on. Except this one was on. The static was deafening. Then it changed. The screen flickered, and suddenly I was looking at myself. The footage was grainy, black and white, but there was no mistaking it. The timestamp was from 3 nights ago. It showed me standing outside my apartment, checking my phone, oblivious to the fact that someone was filming me from the shadows. I swallowed hard. Another shift. A different angle. This time, the camera was inside my apartment. The footage showed me asleep in my bed, chest rising and falling with each slow breath. I staggered back, my stomach twisting into knots. Someone had been inside. Someone had been in my home while I slept. A new message pinged. My fingers shook as I unlocked my phone. Sit. I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of here. But I knew better now. I was being watched. Even here. I lowered myself into the chair, heart hammering against my ribs. Another message. Check under the TV. I reached forward, hand trembling, and felt along the bottom edge of the television. My fingers brushed against something smooth, cold, tape. I peeled it away, and a small envelope fell into my lap. Inside was a single Polaroid. My breath caught in my throat. It was a picture of a door. A familiar one. My front door. A hand was pressed against it, palm flat against the wood, fingers splayed unnaturally wide. But the worst part, the part that sent a bolt of pure terror through my chest, was the hand itself. It was my hand. Same shape. Same veins. Same faint scar across the knuckle. I dropped the photo like it had burned me. My pulse roared in my ears. Another message. Tomorrow, you do something for me, or I walk right through that door. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in my apartment, back pressed against that very door, every light on, clutching a kitchen knife in my shaking hand. But the thing that scared me the most, I had the sinking feeling that, no matter what I did, it was already too late. I grew up near Helsinki. On the international stage, Finland might as well be one big forest, but we have the same ebb and flow of countryside and big cities as everywhere else. I've always been more of a city kind of man, but I've idolized those with a more practical, close-to-nature kind of upbringing. I think you've all met people like that, those who grew up in an area where self-reliance and confidence go hand in hand. Sure, country people might not know the best place to get a rental car, or where to get a cheap beer on a Saturday night, but they can make a log cabin with hand-twined rope and a can-do attitude. Back in 2017, I was working with a documentary crew. We were scouting locations for an upcoming shoot about people living in rural Finland, particularly in the outskirts of the Kainuu region. I was working with a guide named Erky, a stick-like man with round apple-like cheeks and a never-ending smile. He could be telling you the most dreadful things and never lose his endless grin. We were going to go location to location, do some test footage, and then return to base. From there, we would settle on the overall narrative and set out for some proper filming. But for the time being, it was just me and Erky on the road, grasping at straws. It was an exciting time in my life. I was planning to propose to my then-girlfriend Hannah at the final shoot of the documentary. It was months off, but not so long that it felt daunting. Just enough time for me to make an event of it. But that was the future, this was now. And Erky had some bad news to share. We were planning on doing a segment about the silent people of the Kainu region, so that part was scheduled for next month. But we needed something more personal, something about the people who really breathed life into the region. Erky had an idea to follow a man he knew that lived as a sort of hermit, but that fell through at the last minute. So we needed a new idea at short notice. Erky suggested something crazy. He'd heard about a family called the Rickies. These were an almost mythical family, which had only been seen in passing. There was no address and no way to contact them. Erky could swear they were out there, but he wasn't sure how to reach them. If we could find them, they'd be exactly the kind of people we were looking for. It was the end of winter, so the weather was all over the place. We were following an eastbound road, but it had started to snow out of nowhere. Maybe it was the final push before spring, but we suddenly had snow reaching up to our knees. We were on a dirt road, and it was getting harder and harder to see where we ought to turn. Erky stopped to check his GPS, and minutes later we were stuck. It wasn't all doom and gloom. It was bad, sure, but we had supplies and a satellite phone. We'd be fine, but it was one hell of an inconvenience. As Erky checked his gear, I looked out the window, only to see something unexpected. There were 3 people standing by the treeline. 2 men, 1 woman, all dressed in white wool clothes. At first they looked snow-covered, but it dawned on me that they all just had very bright hair, almost platinum blonde. "Is that them?" I asked. Erky leaned over, then nodded at me with that ever-present smile. "Looks like 'em," he said. "I heard they got white hair." They just stood there, looking at us from the treeline, arms hanging loosely at their sides. One of the men, the taller one, adjusted his backpack. It looked heavy. "Should we go say hello?" I asked. "I don't think they get a lot of visitors," he said. "Some people don't think they're real. They look real to me." I raised my hand and waved at them. One of them raised their hand back and looked at it. I don't think he understood the gesture. Erky and I got out of the car and walked up to them. It hadn't dawned on me just how tall they were. They were all in their early 20s, with the woman being slightly younger. They all had this long whitish hair and pale skin. Me and were red from the cold, but the Ricky family was white as ice. Not to mention they were gorgeous. Not a single flaw in their features. Erky extended a hand in greeting, but they misinterpreted it as him reaching for something. They just gave him a curious look and collectively stepped back. "Sorry," I said. "We didn't mean to be rude." Erky nodded and kept his hand out. Then he tapped himself on the chest. "I'm Erky," he said. "What's your names?" The 3 of them just looked at us like we were aliens. The tallest one mimicked Erky's movement and tapped himself on the chest. "Erky," the man said. No, this is Erky," I said, pointing to my guide. "What's your name?" There was no response. One by one they just mimicked the movement, pointing at themselves, then at us, repeating Erky's name. When it was clear that we were misunderstanding one another, the tension eased. We all laughed a little. As we did, they made this unusual noise. It was mixed with their laughter, and it got louder the more they smiled. It went a little something like "Rikikiki," over and over. The namesake of their family, I figured. The shorter man tapped Erky on the shoulder and pointed into the woods, as if asking us to follow. We grabbed our gear, made a note on Erky's GPS, and followed them. All the while, none of them talked, they just made the occasional noise. The 2 men tapped one another on the chest, saying Erky, and laughed about it. The woman seemed less enthused. We followed them for about an hour. Every direction looked the same in the snow, but they never once hesitated. They knew these woods by heart. They were so quiet and comfortable, not once slipping or stumbling. Me and Erky, on the other hand, were barely keeping up. The Ricky family had 2 log cabins deep in the woods. It looked so lived in, with pelts covering the doors, and little wind chimes made from calmly rocking animal bones. The cabins were on a slope leading down to a thin creek, all covered in pine trees. There was also a small shed, which looked more like a large box. The taller man swung his arm out, as if in greeting, and waved us along. Stepping inside the main cabin was like walking into another world. These people must have lived there for decades. Every inch of their cabins had some sort of carving or decoration. They had tools covering the walls, and their own mattresses made from straw and blankets. The cabins were bigger than they looked, as they'd been dug a bit downward into the slope. An old rowboat hung overhead, leaning against the linseed oil-covered supports. We were offered a foul-smelling drink poured from a metal canister. They served it in what looked like repurposed tuna cans. They poured themselves a shot too. The woman declined with a little groaning noise. Erky gave me a when in Rome kind of look, and we downed it. It was all very friendly. We showed them some of our equipment and tried to explain, but they just looked at us with confused smiles. They didn't understand what they were looking at, and giving things names seemed to confuse them. It's like they didn't understand the concept of a name. The only thing even resembling a word that they could say was that ever-present rikikiki kind of noise they made when excited. One of them offered us some dry fish. Out of habit, I thanked him. In response, he held the fish up and said thank you right back. I laughed a little and held the fish up, trying to get him to repeat the word fish. But there was clearly some misunderstanding. After about half an hour of back and forth, I'd accidentally taught him that fish and thank you was the same thing. The two men kept repeating it over and over, and gleefully shared it with the young woman. I got the impression that these people weren't stupid or damaged in any way. They just had a vastly different view of things, and they didn't speak any language in common with us. Maybe not a language at all. Their view of the world was something completely different from ours, and I couldn't imagine what went on in their heads. They were exceptional people to feature in our documentary. While Erky tried to show them some pictures from his phone, I decided to get a better look around the other cabin. There were a couple of oddities, as expected. There were notches on the door for tracking a child's height. I figured that these people had grown up here, never really interacting with those from the outside. It was unheard of, but not impossible. Hell, I had an uncle who lived in North Karelia, who I'd only seen once in my whole life. Some of these people just wanted to be left alone. But there were things I couldn't explain too. For example, they had a whole wall covered in metal zippers. I figured they were used for repairs, but I couldn't see why they'd store them like that. They were hung in a strange pattern, groups of 3 by 3, as in a grid of 9. I counted 26 in total. The longest wall in the cabin was covered in animal pelts of different varieties. I had a hard time identifying them. The Ricky woman entered the cabin after a while. She walked right past me without a word and stepped up to an old mirror. She opened a small case containing a couple of silver chains and some bright red lipstick. She carefully put it on, as if making herself pretty. It was something eerie about it, watching this almost feral woman do something I'd seen my girlfriend do in the bathroom mirror. I was just about to go back to the others when she stopped me. She put her arms around my shoulder, and before I could protest, she leaned in for a kiss. I pulled away. "Sorry," I said. "I'm spoken for. Sorry." She just blinked at me, trying to decipher the noises I made. She looked confused. Then she rolled her eyes and grabbed my hand, going back to the main cabin. There she handed me some more dry fish. Maybe she thought I was hungry. She didn't seem very upset about my rejection. And sure, she was beautiful, but I was about to be an engaged man. It felt wrong, especially from someone I could only barely communicate with. Erky and I were given some more dry goods, and we shared some of our food with the Rickies. I had some crackers and jam, which they spat out with a rikikiki laugh. They didn't like the crumbs. We had a couple more drinks, a few more misunderstandings, and as the sun started to set, I saw the young woman leaning over to give Erky a big kiss with her reddened lips. He didn't seem to mind at all. Surprisingly, this just made the family cheer. Maybe it was some kind of welcome ritual. It didn't seem particularly sexual. By the late evening, we were given a space to sleep on in the second cabin. Erky and I rolled out our sleeping bags and made ourselves comfortable. My head was spinning a bit, mostly because of that foul drink. You could strip the skin of a boar with that thing. Maybe that's what it was used for. Erky and I settled in for the night, listening to the trees rustle up against the side of the cabin. Little wisps of winter air made it through the cracks in the floor. It wasn't a comfortable space, but I could see how one could get used to it, especially if you didn't know any better. "We have to film these people," I whispered into the dark. "They're unique." "Told you," Erky said. "Jackpot. How'd you hear about them?" "All kinds of rumors," he murmured. "There's the usual stuff, like they're not recognized by the government. Paperless. What else?" Some say they sneak around the farms, stealing eggs and milk. Others blame them for bad harvests. I could hear him moving in the dark, trying to get comfortable. His speech slurred a little. Some say they're bad luck, he continued. That they'll grab your kids if you stray. That they'll eat your dogs. That kind of crap. They don't seem like the type, I said. They seem kind of friendly. I'd say, he chuckled. The lips on that woman. And with that, he drifted off to sleep. It took me a bit longer. I was comfortable enough, but there was something about that noise they kept making that just rubbed me the wrong way. Out of all the noises in the world, why that one? Rikiki-ki. Rikiki-ki. We got up early the next day. The Rickies had already been up for a while, milling about outside. It had snowed a lot. We couldn't see the tracks from the night before. I had a rough idea of the direction our car was, but I was getting a bit nervous about finding my way back. Erky didn't seem all too worried though. We had a GPS. The shorter of the two men walked up to me and pulled on my arm, pointing me eastward down the slope. Now I say shorter, but that was only relative to his older brother. He was almost a full head taller than me. It was clear he wanted to show me something. I brought the camera and followed along, asking Erky to wait for me. We didn't walk far. We followed the river for a bit until we got to a flat rock elevation. There was a crack there, which led to a small cave. I'm a bit claustrophobic, but the ease of which the Ricky brother stepped inside calmed my nerves a little. There was a large flat stone wall inside. It was just early enough in the day for the sun to peek through the crack. Any later in the afternoon, and most of this space would be dark. Maybe that's why he wanted to show me in the morning. There was a sort of cave painting there. Not anything spectacular, or even that old, but telling in its own way. Someone had drawn it by hand, leaving prints in the roughly spaced color patches. It took me a while to understand what I was seeing, but once I stepped back, I could understand the whole picture. On the left, there was a line of women, all dressed in white. Brides, seemingly, all walking out of what looked like an old village. They walked past birch trees and pine, all holding bouquets of flowers. At the end of the line, there were bridal dresses thrown to the side, discarded and covered in blood. Next to them were bouquets of colorful flowers. But a couple women remained, holding up bouquets of these unusual blue sunflowers, giving them up as an offering. These women were unharmed, and their dresses as beautiful as ever. And on the right side of the image was what looked like a church with a broken cross. The doors were wide open, but there was only darkness inside. At the very front was a woman in white being handed an infant by a long, gray arm. You know what this means? I asked him. He just smiled at me. Is this you? I asked, pointing at the child. Is that you right here? But he said nothing. Just a long exhale and a faint rikiki. I got a couple of pictures of the cave and followed the brother back to the cabins. It was clear that something about their family was beyond the ordinary, but it was hard to piece it together. It dawned on me just how little I knew about these people. How many generations had they been out here? Who was their mother? And where was she? My mind drifted back to that cave painting, and the woman in white presenting a bouquet to an encroaching darkness. Not afraid, but welcoming. When I came back to the cabins, Erky was gone. The woman was brushing her hair and boiling some kind of glue. She didn't seem at all bothered by me coming back. The older brother was nowhere to be seen. Erky's backpack was gone. So was his equipment. It's like he'd taken it all and just walked out of there, leaving me behind. It didn't make sense. I confronted the young woman, and despite it being a long shot, I asked her. Erky, I said. Where? She didn't understand. As I repeated myself, she put her fingers to her lips, as if asking if I was hungry. I shook my head. Erky, I repeated. I tried to show with my hands how tall he was. I made circles around my cheeks and smiled, as if trying to mimic his face. She just looked at me, muttering that same sound as always. Rikiki. Rikiki. After a couple of hours, the older brother returned. The other two jumped up, yelling excitedly. As they did, the older brother held up something for them to see. I couldn't see what it was, but it dawned on me as he got closer. It was the zipper from a jacket. He gave me a pat on the shoulder as he passed me by to put it on the cabin wall. Looking down on my shoulder, I felt something warm. Blood. They shouted and cheered, ecstatic, repeating that same noise, over and over and over. As the older brother emerged from the cabin, he walked up to me. I pointed at my shoulder and felt my tongue go dry. Erky? I asked. There was no answer, not a glimpse of recognition. He just smiled and dumped his blood-stained gloves in the snow. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea where to go, and I didn't know what to expect. These people lived by a completely different set of rules, and whatever seemed normal to them might be alien to me. I was on their land, living by their law, but I couldn't wrap my head around it. Had they killed Erky? Why? They were as hospitable as ever. They shared drinks and food. They made their own stove bread. They let me borrow a pelt to stay warm around the fire. There was no hint of hostility. In fact, later that night, the woman put on that red lipstick again and offered me another kiss. Again, I declined. All three of them seemed almost disappointed. I apologized, which only seemed to antagonize her. Minutes later, I was handed another dry fish. I forgot. They thought an apology meant something else. For 2 full days, I lived with the Ricky family like nothing happened. I tried to communicate, to get them to guide me back to the car, but the message just didn't get through. I asked for Erky's equipment, the GPS, the satellite phone, anything. And still, they didn't understand. They housed me, fed me, kept me warm, and tried to include me in their chores. One afternoon, the brothers came back with a bunch of scrap. A steering wheel, a hubcap, a car seat. They'd made their way back to Erky's car and looted it. They didn't try to hide it. They even handed me a few of the items, tapping on them, as if asking me what they were. I tried to show them the steering wheel and the way you turn it, but they just thought it looked funny. And with every burst of laughter, that noise bubbled up. Rikikiki. They couldn't help themselves. I kept looking over my shoulder. I'd see the older brother watching me curiously. Whenever I saw him wandering around with an axe or a hammer, I couldn't help but get the feeling that he was looking for an excuse to use it. He'd be all smiles and laughs one moment, but there was always something else hidden deep behind those eyes, an intention, a willingness. I considered running away, to just take what I could and book it. But the same question arose in me. What if I went the wrong way? This was the middle of nowhere, and if I went the wrong way I'd end up in even deeper shit. So I waited. I kept my head down, stayed quiet, and watched. On the 4th day, the whole family wanted to show me something. They pulled me along. I think we went north, past the pines and past the birch trees. We wandered into a clearing where a sliver of mountain rock poked out, making a large flat area with a slight tilt. At the very peak, there was a large patch of blood spatter. The older brother walked off to the side, where a chainsaw hung from a tree. Beneath it was a large hand-woven basket. My heart stopped when he reached for the chainsaw, but he ended up picking up the basket. I think they were confused. They didn't seem to understand why I was nervous. This didn't seem wrong or unusual to them. The younger brother seemed more interested in the chainsaw, reverently patting it. Rikiki-kiki-kiki-ki, he muttered. The others nodded. I looked back and forth between them. The older brother was collecting something in the basket, while the other 2 cleaned and worshipped their chainsaw. An older model, probably from the 80s. The color was suntanned and faded. The chain was worn, but as deadly as ever. Rikiki-ki. That's what that noise meant. They were imitating someone pull-starting a chainsaw. The older brother was cleaning something up. I looked around, but I didn't know what was okay to touch and what wasn't. There was always that feeling of someone on the edge of flipping a switch, turning feral, and doing something terrible to me. These people thought what they were showing me was fine and normal. They didn't understand that it wasn't. The older brother picked up a slab of animal-ravaged meat and slapped it into the basket. An arm, I think. I recognized the color of its jacket. The older brother carried the basket, and I was pushed along by the others. They wanted me to see this. The younger sister even brought my camera along. She must have learned that I associated it with important things, so clearly this was important to them. She couldn't really understand what it did or why I was doing it, but she wanted to share it anyway. I think she genuinely cared. Without her lipstick on, she seemed a lot more relaxed. We came to an open mire. It was surreal. The snow silenced everything but our breaths. I could see an old building in the distance. Perhaps a church, half sunk into the ground. The oldest brother, struggling to carry the large basket of remains, went ahead on his own. The rest of us stood back. The sister poked at my camera, pointing at her brother. This was important to her. I watched through a lens as he wandered off to the building and set the basket down. Moments later, one of the crumbling doors creaked open. I couldn't see exactly what happened, but seconds later, the basket was gone and the door closed. Rikiki-ki, the younger brother and sister hollered. Rikiki-kiki-ki. The older brother raised his arms in a gesture back to them. They all looked to me, confused as to why I wasn't cheering. The sister grabbed my arm, lifting it into the air. She nodded at me enthusiastically. Syllable by syllable, she made me say it with them. She made me cheer. I couldn't say no. I didn't know what they'd do if I did. I just followed along, as my stomach turned upside down. Rikiki. I think another 8 days passed. They showed me how to twine rope and how to light a fire. They took me fishing. The older brother chopped the head off a fish in a swing that was so natural to him that it made me shiver. They showed me how to make tea from pine needles and how to collect and dry edible roots. These people were self-sufficient, and they had no trouble sharing that with me. They treated me like one of them, but there was always that tension, that look from the older brother, those eyes looking for an excuse. I can't describe it as being kept hostage. I could go wherever and do whatever. Hell, I could get a good stab at one of them if I tried. But there were 3 of them, and I couldn't imagine what they'd do once they overpowered me. I thought about hiding a weapon, but I figured they'd notice something missing. They were meticulous about their tools. One morning, they woke me up. The younger brother dragged me out of my sleeping bag and pushed me towards my clothes. He stomped his foot, showing me to hurry. I did. There was a strange noise outside, a machine noise. The other siblings were already on their way down the slope, and I had to hurry to catch up. It didn't take long for us to reach a field. There was a man there, a man on a snowmobile. We all just stopped to look at him, and I could tell he'd noticed us too. The siblings just stood there looking at him. The man waved at us, and I waved back. I was the only one who did. He got off the snowmobile and approached us, taking off his helmet. He said something to me, but it wasn't in Finnish. Might have been a tourist, or someone from across the eastern border. As he got closer, I noticed the sister picking up something from her pocket. Moments later, she'd put on her red lipstick. The stranger walked up to us, seemingly asking a question. He pointed back at the snowmobile, shaking his head. I figured he might be lost. The 2 brothers walked up to him, and the sister faced him head-on. He raised his hand in protest, but when she leaned in for a kiss, he didn't struggle. She kissed him good. He laughed and asked me a question, but I just shrugged. The siblings cheered and hollered, repeating that same noise over and over. But as they did, the older brother shuffled behind the stranger, and as nonchalant as severing the head of a trout, he buried a hatchet in the back of the stranger's skull. Rikiki! Rikiki! They laughed and cheered. The man bled out in the snow. I could barely fathom what had happened. The sister wiped the lipstick off as they waved me over. They looked at me expectantly. When I didn't cheer, their mood seemed to sour. They frowned. The older brother clutched his hatchet a little tighter. He searched my face for something. Finally, I caved. I joined them. I made that same noise, and they lit right back up in cheers and yells. Rikiki. And together, they made me help them carry that man all the way to the clearing in the forest. Past the pines, past the birch trees, leaving a trail of blood behind. I can't go into detail about what they did. I can't. They fired up the chainsaw. They screamed louder than I'd ever heard them scream. And when that thing roared to life, their chatter turned to screeching. They mutilated him, not only cutting into pieces, but making it small enough for wildlife to pick clean. They didn't care about what was in his pockets. The only memento they kept was the zipper from his jacket. It wasn't malice or even practical. It was reverent. They were thankful, if anything. This was a joyous occasion, like kids opening a present. It's one thing to see blood, even a lot of blood, but there's a point where you see something turn from person to body to meat, and that image burns into the back of your eyes like a never-ending cramp. I'd started to put it together. The sister performed a kind of test or initiation. She made herself pretty and offered a kiss. Except, it wasn't just a kiss. It was a sign of consent. To the Rickies, accepting that kiss was to accept your death. You consented to them taking your life. Since I'd never kissed her, I'd never consented. As a result, they treated me with the utmost hospitality, like I was one of them. Erky had kissed her. It had just been a quick peck on the lips, but it was all it took. So they saw it as consent, waited until morning, and took him into the woods to die. They just cut the body up and left it there for the forest creatures to enjoy. They didn't even check the pockets. But before we left, the sister poked me. She gave me my camera, and she pointed, right at the pile of meat from the stranger. She insisted on it. This was important. I could barely function for the rest of the day. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. With every smack of my lips, I imagined the sound of severed meat. But the Rickies continued as usual. They cheered, they laughed, they played. They did their chores and kept their spirits high. If anything, they couldn't understand what was wrong with me. I was offered a salve, so maybe they thought I was sick. They couldn't comprehend that what they were doing was out of the ordinary. When I lay down to sleep that That image kept flashing in the back of my mind. I couldn't differentiate the ringing sound of the chainsaw in my ears from their cackling call. It was all this one nightmarish blend that churned my guts to ice. I had to leave. I had to. The next day, they took me back there. While they filled up their basket with remains, I swallowed my fears and dug through the man's pockets. It didn't take long for me to find the keys to the snowmobile. The Rickies gave me a curious look, but didn't seem to mind. Meat was meat. As long as I didn't interrupt, they didn't care. I figured I could find my way back to the snowmobile. I just had to follow the mire going south, and I'd spot it eventually. I just had to go along and break away from the group. Somehow, we followed the same path, going back to the mire. The smell of the flesh was so pungent I could taste it in my lungs, but I tried to focus on what I had to do. I think they could tell something was off. They were their usual cheerful self, but I couldn't reciprocate. As we reached the open field, the older brother grabbed me by the arm. While he carried the basket, he seemed to want me to come along and bring the camera. He too wanted to show something important. We walked up to the old building. It was much larger than I thought. Fading white wood barely held together, windows battered and broken. A patch of stripped wood above the door in the shape of a missing cross. The older brother put down the basket in front of the door and ushered me forward to take a picture. When I raised my camera, he put a hand on my shoulder, as if to say not yet. So I waited. The door creaked open. I could hear the others hollering from afar, cheering us on. I stepped closer with my camera raised. A long gray arm stretched out, carefully wrapping its fingers, one by one, around the handle of the basket. What little light made its way inside the building showed me the outlines of countless baskets littering the floor, and something shapeless moving in the dark. It gently pulled the basket in. As it did, the older brother made a strange noise. I looked back as his expression changed. Something different. Surprise, perhaps. Then I turned back, only to feel the cold touch of gray fingers wrapping around my throat. I was pulled into the dark. It was so fast. I couldn't see the walls. It's like the room opened up into an endless hallway. There were so many people there, pale white with almost translucent hair. Their eyes were sunken and dark. There were colorful patches of cloth scattered around the floor, with bits and pieces gnawed to the bone, some of which were still gnawed on. Heads slowly turned towards me. Tired, desperate, and starving. Vaguely humanoid, with elongated limbs and absurd proportions. A feeding ground for something inhuman. A sturdy hand grabbed me. I fell backwards, landing in snow. The older brother had pulled me out. I saw the doors close as the gray hand disappeared. There were no cheers. Nothing. They were just as confused as I was. I could barely stand. My legs wobbled. I looked over at the other Rickies and took a deep breath. They were strange, but they had their rules. They didn't kill indiscriminately. They were feeding others, and they weren't doing it without a reason. They asked for permission, but this thing didn't. The older brother didn't like that. Grasping the keys to the snowmobile in my pocket, I started walking. The older brother grasped my hand, searching my face with that cold, dead stare. He wasn't like the rest. He knew something more, I could tell. But even so, he had a code to follow. He wasn't killing for the fun of it, and he wasn't going to let me become unwilling meat. For a moment, I could understand why the Rickies never learned to speak. They didn't need to. This man could tell me everything he wanted without a word. So he let me go. The other Rickies called out to me. There was a sadness to them. They tapped themselves on the chest, mimicking words I'd said before. Things they could only hope to apply. "Erky," the sister called out. "Thank you. Thank you," the younger brother repeated. But I kept walking. I understood, finally, that they weren't going to stop me. The final sound I heard was the sister, wailing by the tree-line, trying to beg me to come back. And the last thing I saw was the older brother turning his back on me. I left them behind. I got to the snowmobile, and I went west. And I didn't stop until I was far, far away. It took hours before I saw another person. A car passing on a country road who stopped for me. I told the police everything, but there was nothing they could do. There were no tracks to follow. All they could do was go look, but everything was covered by the trees. We never finished the documentary. I did end up proposing though, but I could never look at a kiss the same way. It took me some time to warm up to it. I still get shivers from it. To this day, Hannah doesn't understand why she can't wear red lipstick. And I think they're still out there, living in their cabin as a family. And I don't think they'll ever understand why we fear them. Maybe that's for the best. I don't sleep well anymore. Haven't for decades, really. My wife Elaine has grown used to my midnight wanderings, the way I check the locks 3 times before bed, how I flinch at certain sounds, the click of dress shoes on hardwood, the creak of a door opening slowly. She stopped asking about the nightmares that leave me gasping and sweat-soaked in the dark hours before dawn. She's good that way, knows when to let something lie. But some things shouldn't stay buried. I'm 64 years old now. The doctors say my heart isn't what it used to be. I've survived 1 minor attack already, and the medication they've got me on makes my hands shake like I've got Parkinson's. If I'm going to tell this story, it has to be now, before whatever's left of my memories gets scrambled by age or death or the bottles of whiskey I still use to keep the worst of the recollections at bay. This is about Blackwood Reform School for Boys, and what happened during my 6 months there in 1974. What really happened, not what the newspapers reported, not what the official records show. I need someone to know the truth before I die. Maybe then I'll be able to sleep. My name is Thaddeus Mitchell. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Connecticut, the kind of place where people kept their lawns mowed and their problems hidden. My father worked for an insurance company, wore the same gray suit every day, came home at 5:30 on the dot. My mother taught piano to neighborhood kids, served on the PDA, and made pot roast on Sundays. They were decent people, trying their best in the aftermath of the cultural upheaval of the 60s to raise a son who wouldn't embarrass them. I failed them spectacularly. It started small, shoplifting candy bars from the corner store, skipping school to hang out behind the bowling alley with older kids who had cigarettes and beer. Then came the spray-painted obscenities on Mr. Abernathy's garage door. He'd reported me for stealing his newspaper, followed by the punch I threw at Principal Danning when he caught me smoking in the bathroom. By 13, I'd acquired what the court called a pattern of escalating delinquent behavior. The judge who sentenced me, Judge Harmon, with his steel-gray hair and eyes like chips of ice, was a believer in the scared straight philosophy. He gave my parents a choice: 6 months at Blackwood Reform School, or juvenile detention followed by probation until I was 18. They chose Blackwood. The brochure made it look like a prestigious boarding school, with its stately Victorian architecture and promises of rehabilitation through structure, discipline, and vocational training. My father said it would be good for me, would make a man of me. If he only knew what kind of men Blackwood made. The day my parents drove me there remains etched in my memory. The long, winding driveway through acres of dense pine forest. The main building looming ahead, all red brick and sharp angles against the autumn sky. The 10-foot fence topped with coils of gleaming razor wire that seemed at odds with the school's dignified facade. My mother cried when we parked, asked if I wanted her to come inside. I was too angry to say yes, even though every instinct screamed not to let her leave. My father shook my hand formally, told me to make the most of this opportunity. I watched their Buick disappear down the driveway, swallowed by the trees. It was the last time I'd see them for 6 months. Sometimes I wonder if I'd ever truly seen them before that, or if they'd ever truly seen me. Headmaster Thorne met me at the entrance, a tall, gaunt man with deep-set eyes and skin so pale it seemed translucent in certain light. His handshake was cold and dry like touching paper. He spoke with an accent I couldn't place, something European but indistinct, as if deliberately blurred around the edges. "Welcome to Blackwood, young man," he said, those dark eyes never quite meeting mine. "We have a long and distinguished history of reforming boys, such as yourself. Some of our most successful graduates arrived in much the same state as you, angry, defiant, lacking direction. They left as pillars of their communities." He didn't elaborate on what kind of communities those were. The intake process was clinical and humiliating. Strip search, delousing shower, institutional clothing, gray slacks, white button-up shirts, black shoes that pinched my toes. They took my watch, my wallet, the Swiss Army knife my grandfather had given me, saying I'd get them back when I left. I never saw any of it again. My assigned room was on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, a narrow cell with 2 iron-framed beds, a shared dresser, and a small window that overlooked the exercise yard. My roommate was Marcus Reed, a lanky kid from Boston with quick eyes and a crooked smile that didn't quite reach them. He'd been at Blackwood for 4 months already, sent there for joyriding in his uncle's Cadillac. "You'll get used to it," he told me that first night, voice low even though we were alone. "Just keep your head down, don't ask questions, and never, ever be alone with Dr. Faust." I asked who Dr. Faust was. "The school physician," Marcus said, glancing at the door as if expecting someone to be listening. "He likes to experiment. Says he's collecting data on adolescent development or some bullshit. Just try to stay healthy." The daily routine was mind-numbingly rigid. Wake at 5:30 a.m., make beds to military precision, hygiene and dress inspection at 6 o'clock, breakfast at 6:30. Classes from 7:30 to noon, covering the basics but with an emphasis on moral education and industrial skills. Lunch, followed by 4 hours of work assignments, kitchen duty, groundskeeping, laundry maintenance. Dinner at 6 o'clock, mandatory study hall from 7 to 9 o'clock, lights out at 9:30. There were approximately 40 boys at Blackwood when I arrived, ranging in age from 12 to 17. Some were genuine troublemakers, violence in their eyes, prison tattoos already on their knuckles despite their youth. Others were like me, ordinary kids who'd made increasingly bad choices. A few seemed out of place entirely, too timid and well-behaved for a reform school. I later learned these were the private placements, boys whose wealthy parents had paid Headmaster Thorne directly to take their embarrassing problems off their hands. Homosexuality, drug use, political radicalism, things that good families couldn't abide in the early 70s. The staff consisted of Headmaster Thorne, 6 teachers, all men, all with the same hollow-eyed look, for guards called supervisors, a cook, a groundskeeper, and Dr. Faust. The doctor was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and meticulously groomed salt and pepper hair. His hands were always clean, nails perfectly trimmed. He spoke with the same unidentifiable accent as Headmaster Thorne. The first indication that something was wrong at Blackwood came 3 weeks after my arrival. Clayton Wheeler, a quiet 15-year-old who kept to himself, was found dead at the bottom of the main staircase, his neck broken. The official explanation was that he'd fallen while trying to sneak downstairs after lights out. But I'd seen Clayton the evening before, hunched over a notebook in the library, writing frantically. When I'd approached him to ask about a history assignment, he'd slammed the notebook shut and hurried away, looking over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. I mentioned this to one of the supervisors, a younger man named Aldrich who seemed more human than the others. He'd thanked me, promised to look into it. The notebook was never found. Aldrich disappeared 2 weeks later. The official story was that he'd quit suddenly, moved west for a better opportunity. But Emmett Dawson, who worked in the administrative office as part of his work assignment, saw Aldrich's belongings in a box in Headmaster Thorne's office. Family photos, clothes, even his wallet and keys. No one leaves without their wallet. Emmett disappeared 3 days after telling me about the box. Then Marcus went missing. My roommate, who'd been counting down the days until his release, excited about the welcome home party his mother was planning. The night before he vanished, he shook me awake around midnight, his face pale in the moonlight slanting through our window. "Thad," he whispered, "I need to tell you something. Last night I couldn't sleep, so I went to get a drink of water. I saw them taking someone down to the basement. Wheeler wasn't an accident. They're doing something to us, man. I don't know what, but..." The sound of footsteps in the hallway cut him off, the distinctive click-clack of dress shoes on hardwood. Marcus dove back into his bed, pulled the covers up. The footsteps stopped outside our door, lingered, moved on. When I woke the next morning, Marcus was gone. His bed was already stripped, as if he'd never been there. When I asked where he was, I was told he'd been released early for good behavior. But his clothes were still in our dresser. His mother's letters, with their excited plans for his homecoming, were still tucked under his mattress. No one seemed concerned. No police came to investigate. When I tried to talk to other boys about it, they turned away, suddenly busy with something else. The fear in their eyes was answer enough. After Marcus, they moved in Silas Hargrove, a pale, freckled boy with a stutter who barely spoke above a whisper. He'd been caught breaking into summer homes along Lake Champlain, though he didn't seem the type. He told me his father had lost his job, and they'd been living in their car. The break-ins were to find food and warmth, not to steal. "I just wanted us somewhere to sleep," he said one night. "Somewhere warm." Blackwood was warm, but it wasn't safe. Silas disappeared within a week. By then, I'd started noticing other things. The way certain areas of the building were always locked, despite being listed as classrooms or storage on the floor plans. The way some staff members appeared in school photographs dating back decades, unchanged. The sounds at night, furniture being moved in the basement, muffled voices in languages I didn't recognize, screams quickly silenced. The smell that sometimes wafted through the heating vents, metallic and sickly sweet, like blood and decay. I began keeping a journal, hiding it in a loose floorboard beneath my bed. I documented everything, names, dates, inconsistencies in the staff's stories. I drew maps of the building, marking areas that were restricted and times when they were left unguarded. I wasn't sure what I was collecting evidence of, only that something was deeply wrong at Blackwood, and someone needed to know. My new roommate after Silas was Wyatt Blackburn, a heavy-set boy with dead eyes who'd been transferred from a juvenile detention center in Pennsylvania. Unlike the others, Wyatt was genuinely disturbing. He collected dead insects, arranging them in patterns on his windowsill. He watched me while I slept. He had long, whispered conversations with himself when he thought I wasn't listening. "They're choosing," he told me once out of nowhere, "separating the wheat from the chaff. Your wheat, Mitchell. Special. They've been watching you." I asked who they were. He just smiled, showing teeth that seemed too small, too numerous. "The old ones. The ones who've always been here." Then he laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Don't worry. It's an honor to be chosen." I became more cautious after that, watching the patterns, looking for a way out. The fence was too high, topped with razor wire. The forest beyond was miles of wilderness. The only phone was in Headmaster Thorne's office, and mail was read before being sent out. But I kept planning, kept watching. The basement became the focus of my attention. Whatever was happening at Blackwood, the basement was central to it. Staff would escort selected boys down there for specialized therapy sessions. Those boys would return quiet, compliant, their eyes vacant. Some didn't return at all. December brought heavy snow, blanketing the grounds and making the old building creak and groan as temperatures plummeted. The heating system struggled, leaving our rooms cold enough to see our breath. Extra blankets were distributed, scratchy wool things that smelled of mothballs and something else, something that made me think of hospital disinfectant. It was during this cold snap that I made my discovery. My work assignment that month was maintenance, which meant I spent hours with Mr. Weiss, the ancient groundskeeper, fixing leaky pipes and replacing blown fuses. Weiss rarely spoke, but when he did, it was with that same unplaceable accent as Thorne and Faust. We were repairing a burst pipe in one of the first-floor bathrooms when Weiss was called away to deal with an issue in the boiler room. He told me to wait, but as soon as he was gone, I began exploring. The bathroom was adjacent to one of the locked areas, and I'd noticed a ventilation grate near the floor that might connect them. The grate came away easily, the screws loose with age. Behind it was a narrow duct, just large enough for a skinny 13-year-old to squeeze through. I didn't hesitate. This might be my only chance to see what they were hiding. The duct led to another grate, this one overlooking what appeared to be a laboratory. Glass cabinets lined the walls, filled with specimens floating in cloudy fluid, organs, tissue samples, things I couldn't identify. Metal tables gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights. One held what looked like medical equipment, scalpels, forceps, things with blades and teeth whose purpose I could only guess at. Another held a body. I couldn't see the face from my angle, just the bare feet, one with a small butterfly tattoo on the ankle. I recognized that tattoo. Emmett Dawson had gotten it in honor of his little sister, who died of leukemia. The door to the laboratory opened, and Dr. Faust entered, followed by Headmaster Thorne and another man I didn't recognize, tall, blonde, with the same hollow eyes as the rest of the staff. They were speaking that language again, the one I couldn't identify. Faust gestured to the body, pointing out something I couldn't see. The blonde man nodded, made a note on a clipboard. Thorne said something that made the others laugh, a sound like ice cracking. Then they were moving toward the body, Faust reaching for one of the gleaming instruments. I backed away from the grate so quickly I nearly gave myself away, banging my elbow against the metal duct. I froze, heart pounding, certain they'd heard, but no alarm was raised. I squirmed backward until I reached the bathroom, replaced the grate with shaking hands, and was sitting innocently on a supply bucket when Weiss returned. That night, I lay awake long after lights out, listening to Wyatt's wet, snuffling breaths from the next bed. I knew I had to escape, not just for my sake, but to tell someone what was happening. The problem was evidence. No one would believe a delinquent teenager without proof. The next day, I stole a camera from the photography club. It was an old Kodak, nothing fancy, but it had half a roll of film left. I needed to get back to that laboratory to document what I'd seen. I also needed my journal, names, dates, everything I'd recorded. Together, they might be enough to convince someone to investigate. My opportunity came during the Christmas break. Most of the boys went home for the holidays, but about a dozen of us had nowhere to go. Parents who didn't want us, or in my case, parents who'd been told it was therapeutically inadvisable to interrupt my rehabilitation process. The reduced population meant fewer staff on duty, less supervision. The night of December 23rd, I waited until the midnight bed check was complete. Wyatt was gone. He'd been taken for one of those therapy sessions that afternoon and hadn't returned. I had the room to myself. I retrieved my journal from its hiding place, tucked the camera into my waistband, and slipped into the dark hallway. The building was quiet except for the omnipresent creaking of old wood and the hiss of the radiators. I made my way down the service stairs at the far end of the east wing, avoiding the main staircase where a night supervisor was usually stationed. My plan was to enter the laboratory through the same ventilation duct, take my photographs, and be back in bed before the 3 a.m. bed check. I never made it that far. As I reached the first floor landing, I heard voices, Thorne and Faust, speaking English this time, their words echoing up the stairwell from below. "The latest batch is promising," Faust was saying. "Particularly the Mitchell boy. His resistance to the initial treatments is most unusual." "You're certain?" Thorne's voice skeptical. "The blood work confirms it. He has the markers we've been looking for. With the proper conditioning, he could be most useful." "And the others?" A dismissive sound from Faust. "Failed subjects. We'll process them tomorrow." The Hargrove boy yielded some interesting tissue samples, but nothing remarkable. The Reed boy's brain showed potential, but degraded too quickly after extraction. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a sob, something, because the conversation stopped abruptly. Then came the sound of dress shoes on the stairs below me coming up. Click-clack, click-clack. I ran. Not back to my room. They'd looked there first, but toward the administrative offices. Emmett had once mentioned that one of the windows in the file room had a broken lock. If I could get out that way, make it to the fence where the snow had drifted high enough to reach the top, maybe I had a chance. I was halfway down the hall when I heard it, a high, keening sound, like a hunting horn but wrong somehow, discordant. It echoed through the building, and in its wake came other sounds. Doors opening, footsteps from multiple directions, voices calling in that strange language. The hunt was on. I reached the file room, fumbled in the dark for the window. The lock was indeed broken, but the window was painted shut. I could hear them getting closer, the click-clack of dress shoes, the heavier tread of the supervisor's boots. I grabbed a metal paperweight from the desk and smashed it against the window. The glass shattered outward, cold air rushing in. As I was climbing through, something caught my ankle, a hand, impossibly cold, its grip like iron. I kicked back wildly, connected with something solid. The grip loosened just enough for me to pull free, tumbling into the snow outside. The ground was 3 feet below, the snow deep enough to cushion my fall. I floundered through it toward the fence, the frigid air burning my lungs. Behind me, the broken window filled with figures, Thorne, Faust, others, their faces pale blurs in the moonlight. That horn sound came again, and this time it was answered by something in the woods beyond the fence. A howl that was not a wolf, not anything I could identify. The sound chilled me more than the winter night. I reached the fence where the snow had drifted against it, forming a ramp nearly to the top. The razor wire gleamed above, waiting to tear me apart. I had no choice. I threw my journal over first, then the camera, and began to climb. What happened next remains fragmented in my memory. I remember the bite of the wire, the warm wetness of blood freezing on my skin. I remember falling on the other side, the impact driving the air from my lungs. I remember running through the woods, the snow reaching my knees, branches whipping at my face. And I remember the pursuit, not just behind me but on all sides, moving between the trees with impossible speed. The light of flashlights bobbing in the darkness. That same horn call, closer now. The answering howls also closer. I found a road eventually, a rural highway, deserted in the middle of the night 2 days before Christmas. I followed it, stumbling, my clothes torn and crusted with frozen blood. I don't know how long I walked. Hours, maybe. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when headlights appeared behind me. I should have hidden. It could have been them, searching for their escaped subject. But I was too cold, too exhausted. I stood in the middle of the road and waited, ready to surrender, to die, anything to end the desperate flight. It was a state police cruiser. The officer, a burly man named Kowalski, was stunned to find a half-frozen teenager on a remote highway at dawn. I told him everything, showed him my journal, the camera. He didn't believe me, not really, but he took me to the hospital in the nearest town. I had hypothermia, dozens of lacerations from the razor wire, 2 broken fingers from my fall. While I was being treated, Officer Kowalski called my parents. He also, thankfully, called his superior officers about my allegations. What happened next was a blur of questioning, disbelief, and finally, reluctant investigation. By the time the police reached Blackwood, much had changed. The laboratory I discovered was a storage room filled with old desks and textbooks. Many records were missing or obviously altered. Several staff members, including Thorne and Faust, were nowhere to be found. But they did find evidence, enough to raise serious concerns. Blood on the basement floor that didn't match any known staff or student. Personal effects of missing boys hidden in a locked cabinet in Thorne's office. Financial irregularities suggesting payments far beyond tuition. And most damning, a hidden room behind the boiler, containing medical equipment and what forensics would later confirm were human remains. The school was shut down immediately. The remaining boys were sent home or to other facilities. A full investigation was launched, but it never reached a satisfying conclusion. The official report cited severe institutional negligence and evidence of criminal misconduct by certain staff members. There were no arrests. The key figures had vanished. My parents were horrified, of course, not just by what had happened to me, but by their role in sending me there. Our relationship was strained for years afterward. I had nightmares, behavioral problems, trust issues. I spent my teens in and out of therapy. The official diagnosis was PTSD, but the medications they prescribed never touched the real problem. The knowledge of what I'd seen, what had nearly happened to me. The story made the papers briefly, then faded away. Reform schools were already becoming obsolete, and Blackwood was written off as an extreme example of why such institutions needed to be replaced. The building itself burned down in 1977, an act of arson never solved. I tried to move on. I finished high school, went to community college, eventually became an accountant. I married Elaine in 1983, had 2 daughters who never knew the full story of their father's time at Blackwood. I built a normal life, or a reasonable facsimile of one. But I never stopped looking over my shoulder, never stopped checking the locks 3 times before bed, never stopped flinching at the sound of dress shoes on hardwood, because sometimes on the edge of sleep, I still hear that horn call. And sometimes when I travel for work, I catch glimpses of familiar faces in unfamiliar places. A man with deep-set eyes at a gas station in Ohio, a small man with wire-rimmed glasses at an airport in Florida. They're older, just as I am, but still recognizable. Still watching. Last year, my daughter sent my grandson to a summer camp in Vermont. When I saw the brochure, with its pictures of a stately Maine building surrounded by pine forest, I felt the old panic rising. I made her withdraw him, made up a story about the camp's safety record. I couldn't tell her the truth, that one of the smiling counselors in the background of one photo had a familiar face, unchanged despite the decades. That the camp director's name was an anagram of Thorne. They're still out there, still operating, still separating the wheat from the chaff, still processing the failed subjects. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if I truly escaped that night, if this life I've built is real, or just the most elaborate conditioning of all. A comforting illusion, while whatever remains of the real Thaddeus Mitchell floats in a specimen jar in some new laboratory, in some new Blackwood, under some new name. I don't sleep well anymore, but I keep checking the locks. I keep watching, and now I've told my story. Perhaps that will be enough. But I doubt it.